I'll tell you one group that are getting, well, I don't know if they're getting noisy, but people are getting noisy about them, the Green Party in particular, because they see them as people who are likely to vote for them, students, the Scarfies, those who won't go and get a real job when they quit school, but continue. I'm getting Ben to laugh because he's just finished a degree. Those who decide that, I don't know, they'll stay at mum and dad's, or they just don't want to engage with the real world and pay their taxes for a few years yet. So I don't know, they go and study, women's studies or equality or something at university. And of course, Jim Bolger famously lifted the toll gate on the road to knowledge, and we created student loans in all sorts of ways that people could afford to go to university, so it was not the preserve of the sons and daughters of Hawke's Bay farmers. But now the students, the Scarfies, they're screaming poverty. The flat isn't that warm. I don't know, we haven't got Sky Television. The spa pool, do you know how much that costs to run? That's right. And of course the Greens, the Green Party is winding them up. But is there a problem? Is there a problem for our student population? And do limitations on the amount of money they can access to fund them during their non-productive study years, can we do better in that regard? Joining us to discuss this in the economics of tertiary education and being a student is Economist Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative. Nice to have us with you again, Eric. Good morning to you.
Great to be here. Good morning.
All right. Do the students have a point or not?
Sure. Cost of living has been skyrocketing under an inflation-happy central bank. Housing costs have gone through the roof. Rents are insane. None of those are specific to students. They'll also be hitting across the board. Of course, students are lower income, so it'll hit them more than others. One of the perverse outcomes that we wind up in, though, when there's a housing crisis is the more money that you wind up giving to people to help them afford cost of living, the more they can just help bid up rents until we get housing sorted. So it's a difficult one to solve. Part of the solution is, of course, solving housing. It's something that we've been on for rather some time, make it a lot easier for people to build, make it easier for universities to put up halls of residence. It would be a nonsense if universities were missing out on students that they'd like to have. If there were housing that the universities could build, like halls of residence, that would be profitable for the universities, but then the government blocks them from putting in more halls of residence because the neighbors might complain a bit.
Okay. So, Eric, you're saying, I'm being a bit harsh when I say the students are just whinging. There are a whole lot of economic winds blowing that while they hit everyone, students in some instances are particularly vulnerable to those problems.
Sure. You're on lower income. Ideally, well, I don't know if it's ideal, but when I was a student, I studied during the school year and I worked my ass off during the summers to try and make money to fund the rest of my studies, along with student loans to help along the way. If you're having to work full time to fund your studies while you're studying, you're not going to be able to study full time or at least be successful in it. It's hard to be focused on your studies in those circumstances. Borrowing makes an awful lot of sense. So the usual arguments.
Hang on, I want to stop you there, Eric. We've got record low unemployment. Seasonal, and if you like, crap work jobs that don't require much brain power are all over the place. I tweeted about a week or two ago, I think Goras Garriman or Julian just the problem to student, poverty is simple. And I said, yeah, it is simple. Go and get a bloody job because there are plenty of them around.
Every summer, people should be working, right? There is plenty of work. I'd be a little bit nervous to do it during the course of study. If you're wanting to focus intensely on your study, people treat the experience differently, right? Some students work really hard. They progress quickly. Others take it as a bit of a holiday. If you are taking it as a bit of a holiday, then it's kind of silly to spend that time not working. You should be working during that time anyway. In your studies, if you've decided not to work on your studies, then you could be in gainful employment.
So what I'm saying is don't the students just have their own bloody laziness to blame for the problems they're in an environment where there's work all over the show? And I'm sorry, you got to work at the pizza joint and study during the day or whatever. That seems to me most successful people I know did that during their varsity careers anyway.
Well, working during the summers totally makes sense. It depends on the program that you're in. If you're in a program where if I think back to my uni days, I was waking up at 6 a.m. to do calculus drills before going in for breakfast, and then going to classes all day. And a rigorous approach to study requires an awful lot of work. If you're taking a rigorous approach to study, it would be difficult to combine that with
Okay. All right.
serious amount of work. If you're working a few hours on the side, that's one thing. If you're getting into spots where housing is really, really expensive, you just can't do it.
Okay. Let's say then the lazy little snowflakes won't go and work harder. How do we provide income for them or allow them to finance themselves through this terrible period of having to study at a tertiary institution?
Well, some of them might be lazy, but the ones who are actually diligently pursuing their studies, it's just work in a different area, right? It's work that only pays off 20 years later when you've got far more human capital, you've got a better degree, a better education, and a stronger career path. Yeah. And that's exactly the point when you should wind up paying for what you were doing at university. And that's what a student loan does. Yeah. It shifts income from the period when you're earning a lot more because you were successful in studies to the period when you're trying to live on, trying to finance those studies.
All right. So at the moment, and I'm sorry, I've got a young person who's just finishing up, or an offspring, a son, who's just finishing up his last year after I've lost count how long he's been in study. He hasn't borrowed an awful lot of money at all, but I know for many a student loan is the way to go. And student loans at present, right, are interest free. You do not pay interest on your student. And I've always seemed to be, I'd love to go back to university. I'd borrow a whole lot of money. I'd lend it to someone else at an interest rate, and I'd just live off the difference. Is there a limit?
Well, that's exactly the problem, right?
Yeah.
So I was on faculty at Canterbury when 0% loans came in, and I remember walking into the intermediate microeconomics course I was teaching at the time and said, okay, well, they're shifting the loans to 0%. How many of you are going to up your borrowing to the max and then put the rest into a Rabobank term deposit at 8%? And because that's what the going interest rates were.
That's what the smart money would have done.
Yeah, had 2/3 of the hands in the room go up. The problem that you get with that, though, is if I'm thinking, okay, my kids in 5-6 years' time, or at least for one of them, if they're going to Vic, they'll be living at our house. We'd be helping them with living expenses here. If they borrow to the max at 0%, that's really helping me. That's not helping the kids or anybody else. If you're thinking about a kid from a low-income background who doesn't have that support, they actually need to borrow a lot of money against future earnings to be able to seriously afford study. If they're moving away from home to do it, like student allowances go up if you're moving away from home. If you're not living with your parents, you get a higher student allowance. But that's not really keeping up with living costs, and it can't really. The housing costs keep outpacing it. And it'd be inequitable, really, if it did as well, because students who succeed at university go on to earn an awful lot more when they're out in the real world. So if you're using the general tax base to subsidize people while they're in study to an even greater extent than it already is, it's an inequitable transfer. It's giving money from the general tax base to people who in general are coming from wealthier backgrounds. Because if you look at the progression to tertiary study statistics, kids who went to a decile 9 or 10 school, 70% of them wind up in tertiary study in their first year after school, but less than 50% of kids from a decile 1 and 2 school do. So it's one of these horrible spots where, well, you can just look so kind and good and everything nice, right? If you
we might need.
It's regressing. It's transferring money from the tax base in general to people who are, in general, coming from wealthier backgrounds and who will go on to be richer themselves. Student loans do the opposite. They transfer money from when you'll be richer to when you are poorer. It's a within-person transfer, except for the 0% write-down. So the subsidy that's provided through the student loan scheme, it's worth about 40% of the value of the loan, or at least in the most recent stats, that was about the amount of the write-down on initial lending.
Okay.
So it turns into like $500 million a year.
So I haven't been to varsity, so you've lost me at some stage here, Eric. But you're suggesting we should reintroduce interest on student loans. Tell me how that makes it easier for lower income students or for students to get ahead and cope.
Sure. So this comes from some work that we had done in 2016 on the 10-year anniversary of the student loan scheme. We'll have to update it. The original project was called Decade of Debt, looking back over that prior 10 years. It could be a decade and a half of debt now. When government lends at 0%, it finds lending to be really, really costly, right? If you were starting to lend people money at 0%, you're throwing money away with every dollar that you're lending out, even though you're going to get paid back later. So we've got a really good repayment scheme. It's income contingent. IRD will chase you up. If you're overseas, well, they're starting to get more multinational tax agreements on chasing that stuff up too. When government loses money every time it lends out money, and it has limited amounts of money, it tries to restrict how much it loses. And that exhibits itself in a lot of ways. The most obvious one is that it limits how much students are able to borrow. And it has to, right? Like, even if they didn't care about budget constraints and they were happy to double the size of government spending, well, I would borrow infinity money at 0% and put it into term deposits. You have to put some boundary on it. Otherwise, people will rort the system. Whenever you put a boundary on it, those who face the highest costs of studying, whether they're going on for medical school or a longer term of study, or they're coming from backgrounds where they have less parental support, they are the ones who will be hurt the most because they will not be able to access the funds that are sufficient for their program of study. That's one consequence. But another one comes through in how the universities deal with the government. So whenever universities increase tuition fees to cover the costs that the universities face, government winds up bearing a huge portion of that cost because students borrow against their tuition costs. That means that government wants to restrict how much universities charge for tuition fees. So in the late 2000s, when this was coming in, the government pretty explicitly told the universities, you're not going to make as much money from domestic students anymore. Go chase internationals. And that explains the big run up in international students over that period. But now the universities are in a spot where they can't get international students anymore. That tap got turned off with the border closures, and they've been having trouble getting that back open again. Immigration New Zealand isn't really processing visas the way that it used to. And the universities are under fee cap maxima where they can't increase tuition fees by more than I think is 2% this year or thereabouts when inflation is close to 8%. How do you keep staff when you can't increase your prices? The amount that the government is chipping in isn't really there, and you've lost a massive amount of your revenue stream. All of these flow from the decision to subsidize students broadly, regardless of circumstances, through a subsidy in the student loan scheme, through 0% funding. If you reinstated interest in the student loan scheme, the government would have about another $500 million a year to play with. It could use that $500 million a year to fund means-tested scholarships for students coming in from lower decile schools with serious academic chops. But more importantly, it could use that money to help improve preparation for tertiary at schools that have a poor track record of getting bright kids through into university. Not everybody should go to university, but if you've got sharp kids that you identify through testing, and some schools that have a weak track record of getting them into the areas where they're going to flourish best, man, that needs to get fixed. It's a horrible injustice, right? That's the real barrier to entry in tertiary. It's not the funding side. It's the schools that aren't prepping them appropriately. Again, look at those bi-decile stats on progression to tertiary. Take the $500 million a year, put it into the areas that are an actual serious barrier to keeping people from accessing tertiary, and reintroduce interest on loans.
So what you're saying, the interest on loans, and I'm talking very broadly here, means that we get more money going to the people who need it most in our tertiary education system.
That's how I would do it. I would reinstate interest on the loans in order to be able to provide stronger means-tested scholarships and better support to help schools to prepare kids for tertiary.
Okay, what sort of political reaction have you had to this idea?
Well, it seems toxic. Nobody can see past the first stage of it. It's a very popular middle-class welfare program. Poor kids who never access university have no voice in it. They're underprepared. Their schools are a mess. Parents of kids who enjoy getting the subsidy through the 0% loan scheme, they like it. Kids who are getting 0% loans, they like it. Nobody likes the idea of repayments. When we had run the numbers on this in 2016, it looked like re-adding interest onto the median loan would add about 1 year to repayment times. So it's not end of the world stuff, right? Those numbers would change now if we had to update it. Interest rates were a bit higher back then, but loans have gone up a little bit too. We'd have to recalibrate the numbers. But it's not like stretching it out massively for the median loan holder. If somebody's gone on to...
So this idea has about as much chance of being implemented, Eric, as I do as getting a PhD in applied physics, really.
Well, some good things we just aren't able to have because of the way politics works. And it's just tragic, right? The recommendation we've got in here is about the most left-wing thing I've ever put up.
I was just going to say also it's incredibly out of character. Yeah.
No, I go for what works and what makes sense, right? And in this case, the existing setup is highly regressive. And it's not just me saying this, right? So if you look at work done in America, their student loan scheme is worse than ours. Susan Dynarski, she's an a superb economist, very left-wing. Circa 2014, she was doing some work on the U.S. student loan scheme, noting how regressive it is. She was suggesting implementing things that look an awful lot like New Zealand's scheme, where you have income contingent repayment, run it through the tax system, only have sort of interest rate subsidy during study. Now, they don't run the same interest rate subsidies that we've got, but income contingent repayment means that if you rack up a lot of money in debt and you wind up not earning a lot later, well, government kind of eats that cost. You're not having to pay huge amounts when you have very low income. You're only paying it on income above a threshold. And that's how it works here. Surveys of American economists in the US, they all agree that student loan subsidies, in that context, there's been debate in the US about, let's just write off all the student debt to try and help people. Economists universally in the US say that that's horribly regressive. Yeah. Okay, they understand this. But the popular perception of it, because the saddest thing for me is when green activists who claim to care about social justice and poverty want to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to kids who are from richer backgrounds or who will go on to be richer instead of targeting where it's needed, right? I'm left of the Green Party on this. This is a crazy old world.
Eric, I'm so glad to see you passionate because I was just sitting there thinking, here is Eric Crampton arguing for a system that delivers more to people at the bottom of the heap and stops making it so easy, and I'm going to be brutal, for white middle-class kids to game the bloody system, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah. Have you tried to kind of engage the Greens on this, or are they just not even interested?
That's not their electoral base. They don't care about poor people. They care about people who are going to university. And they're happy to continue catering to that.
Ever been in the same room as Chloe Schwalbrook and had a conversation? Because she's not dumb, you know.
No, I've not talked to her on this one. She was yelling at me on Twitter about it, but I've talked with her about drug reform. She is sharp. I like Chloe, but there's a blockage on thinking through this one, I think.
Eric, thanks for explaining it to me, my non-tertiary educated mind. And that's the problem with free money. No one ever turned it down, did they? Or in some ways, valued it the way it should be valued. Eric, so nice talking to you again, mate. Have a good day and have a good weekend. That is you Eric too. Crampton, economist from the New Zealand Initiative, who, it has to be said, are generally perceived as somewhere right of Attila the Hun. But the way he explained it, I think, made perfect sense. The problem with interest-free loans is they provide a level of comfort to people who simply don't need it. You know, the sons and daughters of accountants who live in Greylin or Epsom and Remuera and Thorndon and other nice leafy suburbs. Because free money, of course, is easily accessible to all. I think Eric makes amazing sense. And I have to say, Paul, for a normally conservative right-wing economist, that's as passionate as I've seen Eric got. I thought he was going to rave a red flag, scream revolution and, you know, throw up a barricade in downtown Wellington.
It was very impressive.
It was. So I'm going to recommend that you go back and listen to that slowly. If, like me, you do not have the advantages of a state-subsidised tertiary education.
Neither do I.
No. That boat sailed and I was too busy drinking to get on it. No. I did. Actually, I do have a tertiary education. I have a certificate of journalism from what was then Wellington Polytechnic, which now makes me an alumni of Massey University, to my constant shame and disappointment because they're so woke.